Hello, everyone. Welcome to Take the Black Club, the above and beyond extra special, super awesome experience for the dedicated winteriscoming.net fan. I am Dan Selke, the editor of the site, and I am here with Brian, never said your last name out loud, Frydenborg.
Hey, you got, most people are terrible at that, so you actually distinguish yourself early on here, sir.
Oh, excellent. And today I wanted to have you on, Brian, because you wrote a massive article for Wick like a couple weeks back.
And only you and I know how massive the original
Yes, it was even bigger than it went up. It was called, Yes, the final season of Game of Thrones was a chaotic mess, and it was glorious. And I mean, like, a lot of research went into it, obviously. I thought it was, I mean, it was very obviously a laborious task. It took some doing to put together these really like long arguments. You had lots of historical references. You had lots of juicy analysis in there. And I thought it was, more than worth talking about a little bit because you put so much work into it. And I wanted to have you on and get some of your take on, what you said in the article, basically, and try to maybe explain the big points to our beautiful viewers out there.
Sure, and I really appreciate it. And whether or not the viewers hate what I had to say, loved it, or somewhere in between, as a freelancer, I love the attention. But no, anyone that takes the time to read anything I write, I'm always deeply appreciative.
I mean, it was nice. Like, we got like dozens and dozens of comments. So people,
some we
I think
can't
it did
probably say and repeat the contents of here, but still, the passion was great.
The passion. All right. So what mainly was, I guess. So tell me if I missed it in your thesis. Your kind of idea was that in the final season of Game of Thrones, which, as we all know, got a lot of blowback among, the people of the internet after it aired. People were calling out for characters making dumb decisions, for just the plot not hanging together really well. And your, what I thought, pretty intriguing thesis, or at least, I mean, you covered a lot, but like what a big chunk of it was that, yes, a lot of the character decisions were pretty stupid or foolish, but that was actually true to life and a accurate reflection of what would have been the reality of their situation. Is that in the ballpark?
Yeah, no, I would say that's very much in the ballpark. And I'd further add to that, not only was it true to life, but it was that stupidity and that illogic was presented in such a breakthrough way for not just fantasy genre, but for most television series in general. And I actually linked to this piece, I believe, and it may not have been in this version, but there's a series on HBO called Generation Kill.
Okay.
And it was 7 parts, and it was based on a book by a reporter from Rolling Stone who was embedded with this Marine unit that was the tip of the spear going into Iraq up through the fall of Baghdad in 2003. And you get a very unvarnished view of what happened. And there are so many mistakes, at least as much of the energy of this one small group of Marines is expended dealing with their own officers and other parts of the U.S. military, complicating and making certain situations, making poor decisions, and them having to react to it and kind of, unscrew themselves from like pretty crazy situations that like didn't need to happen at all. And that's a pretty unique series in and of its depiction of that chaos and stupidity. And it's not showing everybody as being these noble leaders and always making great decisions, and everybody's always trying their best and is on top of things. And so you have that one series, just 7 episodes, 7 hours. Mm-hmm. But then almost every other war series, I mean, yeah, sometimes they deal with mistakes and this and that, but it's by and large just kind of, I don't even want to say romanticization. It's either an anti-war situation where it just sort of shows like the level of death and how awful that can be, but it doesn't focus on kind of the decision-making processes of the main characters and the command structure. And so what I loved about Game of Thrones is we had almost a decade of really being able to look at, even though it was a fantasy that was very much supposed to be based in reality. And I just thought the originality of the way it presented that was just brilliant. And I was so disappointed that seemed a huge portion of the fans completely missed that, didn't appreciate it, and after years of all these surprises and twists and turns, seemed to expect an ending where everyone made competent decisions, and what we wanted for each of the surviving characters is what they were supposed to be getting. And I just kind of...
It was a bit of a downer, wasn't it? I mean, okay, so I'll try to argue back here a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, okay, so like, what's an example, do you think, of something from the final season of Game of Thrones that kind of shows this stupidity as accurate reality stuff?
Well, just people gave Tyrion a tough time, so I just want to say something briefly about him, because in some ways he got picked on the most for being the most stupid. Yeah. And he obviously made calls with his sister that did not pay off in the end.
Right.
And that was a little bit easier on him than everybody else, basically. But
you definitely pulled your punches with Tyrion.
Yeah. Because in the end, he was trying to save as many lives as possible. He and Varys. And what I loved about Varys' development, as a quick aside, is we kind of didn't get that from him until towards the end. Like, we didn't realize how noble his motives were really until the final seasons. So that was kind of a nice twist. But with Tyrion, he was trying so hard to engage Cersei in the one way that he thought. And to be fair, when you look at Cersei and the way she fought like a lioness for her children, from the first episode, all the way through pretty much the very end, betting that she might actually be reachable because of her unborn child was not the dumbest thing in the world. Right. So people were picking on him for that. Now, I'm not saying that was the best decision, but I'm just saying it's not as stupid as everything else. So now that I got that out of the way, I mean, pretty much Jon Snow's just kind of ignoring of reality, the way Sansa was engaging with kind of the courtroom intrigue when like everyone's life was on the line with whites coming at them. Like just the way people prioritized the wrong things at the wrong time. Simple battle tactics, charging the Dothraki into the horde of oncoming zombies, and these are all incredibly stupid things. And yet, I actually link in my article. There's a famous poem from a famous battle about the charge of the Light Brigade, where in the Crimean War, I think it was 1853, maybe it was 1856, but you had cavalry charge headlong into pre-modern artillery, and they got wiped out pretty much. So that happened in real life. And that happened in the 19th century, when we like to think of ourselves in that Victorian kind of era as being more enlightened and maybe less barbaric, and yet there we have that happening. So I think, there are so many different decisions. We could go through individual ones and really pick them apart if you want.
Every single bit, but
many, and even most of the decisions, there are so few competent decisions made towards the end.
I mean, I guess I'd say that for a lot of the show, like, characters are making decisions based on things other than cold, hard logic and what is the best course of action. But I don't think they got like the vitriolic response that the last season got. Like, what would you say if someone argued that even if people acting foolishly is true to life, that the show didn't sell it in a way that we could be satisfied with it?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think this is the thing that also astounds me, is that the viewers are complaining that they're not satisfied. I don't think anyone was satisfied with the Red Wedding, and yet that's one of the most brilliant surprises in the history of television. Nobody wanted that outcome. No one enjoyed that.
I mean, I'd argue that they didn't want it, but they were satisfied with it. Like, so much so that it kind of became the series, trademark. I think there's a difference between something horrible happening, like a plot twist, and satisfying you in like kind of a deep, I don't know, even unconscious way as, yes, I need more of this drama, and something just ringing a little false or just not being set up properly. I think that was what people were reacting to in the final season.
So let's talk about the setup. We can go back to the Red Wedding, right? Okay. That really did come from nowhere. We had a couple of hints with Roose Bolton, but by and large, he seemed to be a loyal bannerman until Catelyn Stark kind of noticed the armor. And there were, again, a tiny few hints, and this comes to the whole Daenerys turning thing that is something that, a lot of people talked about as well. There were more hints about Daenerys turning than Roose Bolton turning. Now, they were spread out over a much longer period of time, and I am not saying they were handled in the most gradual buildup. We can start to see this coming. Oh, wow. It wasn't done in this kind of way that we see in quote unquote normal storytelling. And I do think that it was more jarring. I think it was certainly more jarring and less expected, but I think that's part of what maybe, if not the showrunners were trying to get at. Even so, it's part of what I appreciate about the 8th season, because I think we get so caught up in what our hopes were that we don't appreciate how gritty and real this show is supposed to feel, and the fact that it is jarring and so unexpected, even without the buildup. Because how many times do you really get buildup? I mean, just in our own reality. I'm not saying what side you should be on, but think about how shocked people were in 2016 when our presidential election in the U.S. turned out the way it did, and people absolutely did not, for the most part, see that coming. Now, I'm somebody who actually was a bit more worried about a certain outcome than most people, but most people I talked to were shocked. So there was no, wow, we really have the proper setup points to, and yes, I do respect the argument that a lot of people make. Well, this is fantasy, this is fiction, this is supposed to be like taking me away from reality. I don't want it to be as disappointing and jarring and nonsensical as reality. But I also think that I don't know how they reconcile their fandom of the series with earlier settings that were the same way. But you were trying to make a point about maybe the delivery was different.
Yeah, I was back in the day. Who can remember? Speaking of Daenerys' massacre, so your section of the article on that I liked because you, obviously you've looked into history. Are you like a historian by any chance, or have studied this kind of stuff?
I mean, I majored in history as an undergraduate. I did a lot of historical studies in my graduate program as well. And I'm continuing to do stuff like that on my own. So I like to think of myself as knowing something about history.
Cool. I mean, maybe like a George R. R. Martin style, like armchair historian, or I guess you're more like a proper, like academically trained one, or at least a bit. Not that it really matters here, but good for
I would argue that the academy is still relevant, but that's a whole nother thing. But yeah.
Okay. In terms of the massacre, I just like history in general, and I liked how you kind of linked it up to, older massacres throughout history. Are there any that kind of jump out at you as antecedents to what happened there? Or are there times in history where, things just... Because I think like something people had trouble with Daenerys' massacre was it happened kind of on a snap decision. That it was, again, like, we can argue whether it not being built up to was a good or a bad thing, but it did come on suddenly. And I think your argument was basically that, that kind of thing does happen. And are there, in your historical brain, kind of interesting antecedents you can point out to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's so many nameless massacres that are not well detailed. People will never know about villages, tribes that, were not given voices. It may have been in the middle of the Congo in the late 19th century where some of these villages and communities were not engaging in written language, and they didn't have survivors who spoke English who could pass that story on in a way that would be picked up by global media. And a lot of times it just rested on the cruel whims of whoever happened to be in charge of whatever small detachment of soldiers that happen to have guns versus people with spears. And you don't need that many people with guns to kill many, many people with spears. And sometimes you had... Actually, if you look at the whole situation with Native Americans in the West, there's a real confused command structure. When Ulysses Grant is president, he's actually trying to make nice and honor the commitments with that we had made to a lot of the Native American tribes, and then individual commanders would run off and do something crazy, like Custer. And the massacre ended up being, quote unquote, massacre on the other side because he took a few hundred cavalry, split them up, and then went right into the territory of the enemy. But there were other commanders and other years during the long wars that the U.S. fought against the Native Americans where an individual commander would just start massacring a town. And he didn't have specific orders to do that. It was just what he decided to do at the time. And it wasn't the type of culture where we have now where typically soldiers would really speak up against those kinds of things. In fact, even if you look at the Battle of the Crater, 1864, Confederate, quote-unquote, Confederate forces massacred a bunch of African-American prisoners that they took. And that was not a specific order. There was kind of a policy, but it's not like anyone gave an order at the time. People just collectively started, much like Jon Snow's Northmen at the end in King's Landing. They just kind of went for it. They felt the bloodlust, and the environment was that brutal at the time, and they gave into their inner devils.
I guess maybe the problem is that, obviously those things have happened throughout history many, many, many times, going back to like ancient pre-Roman history. I mean, I wonder if the problem is that because the Game of Thrones show as a, dramatic serialized narrative was so focused on understanding these like bunch of individuals and understanding, how events played out through their perspective, that not understanding why Daenerys made that decision in that moment sticks out as a bigger sticking point. But maybe you would argue, I think you might, based on your article, that not really. Well, first, let me just clarify this. Would you kind of agree that we don't fully understand why Daenerys did what she did? Like, not fully, not completely?
I think we're kind of, we're cheating a little bit because I think we both probably seen, as many people have, the behind the scenes commentary by Dan and Dave. Sure. I guess it's hard for me not to factor that in, but I will say that even factoring that out, I got the sense that we weren't really supposed to know why she did what she did, even if Dan and Dave hinted at it, and they certainly didn't elaborate and go into any kind of complex. She just, heard the bells, kind of saw red, and decided enough was enough. And, so, and I think I mentioned this in terms of the whole Nuremberg and Bin Laden situation. With Bin Laden, we got a whole manifesto and tapes. Right. With Nuremberg, we had a trial where we got to really hear in detail what happened. But so many times, I think these things happen and they're either swept under the rug, or we never really do get a fitting, denouement. I mean, for example, Nadia Murad is this ISIS sex slave survivor. And one of the things she's crusading about is, like, why are we not having trials of these people? Because my people, the Yazidi religious minority that were massacred and enslaved by these people, we never got to actually confront our rapists, our murderers, to people who killed my family. I never got to hear from them, really. Like, there was no moment for her. And so many of these people are being killed on the battlefield in Syria and Iraq. And that community, those Yazidis, they may never have that moment of justice where they get to look their accusers or a representative of their community does in a courtroom and be like, why did you do this? Like, how do you feel about it now? And I think we want to live in a world where it's Nuremberg. We want to live in a world where we see the tapes and maybe then we get Bin Laden in a drone strike, but we understand why they did it. And I think the sad truth is that we often are like Nadia Murad, where we want answers, we want an explanation, and we simply won't have it. And to your point about the narrative and us being it through, seeing the series through individuals for so much, it was interesting because it was such a deliberate, and they made this point in the commentary, they deliberately went away from Daenerys and towards the crowd so you could feel like what it was for everybody else. And that was such a rare departure for the series that, was obviously a very deliberate thing that they were trying to do. So,
although funny,
and it had a chilling effect.
Right. Although funny you mentioned that, because you're right. I just did that article about the deleted scenes, and it's starting to look like we were supposed to see her more. I think the director may have decided to. I didn't really. Someone else looked up deleted scenes, but it looks like they actually. This is kind of a sidebar, but fun sidebar. That they did that. The script provided we should see her again. But the director, I'm trying to piece this together from like little bits and don't know exactly what they talked about, that the director made the decision to not show her at all, which is kind of what I'm assuming now based on the deleted scenes and what the director has said. So that's another little
close-up that I'm looking at. Okay.
Yeah, which is another, little wrinkle. But, as we said, we can't ever know these sort of things completely. There is an unknowability to history, life, and television. I mean, I wonder, again, kind of some of my other point, if, like, I totally hear what you're saying about, the randomness of some of these heinous acts throughout history and the inability to really confront and understand what was done to you if you suffered an atrocity. I mean, I guess in TV, in drama, we're more accustomed to it being a Nuremberg situation where they do lay out the facts for you. And they do kind of lay out what happened to Norman Bates at the end of Psycho or whatever. But yeah, it didn't happen here. So I think, so would you argue that not knowing what really drove Daenerys in those final moments could be a positive and more in keeping with the show's central ethos?
Well, I think on one level, it's an example of the weakness, which we talk about briefly in the article, or I talked about briefly in the article, and we discussed before. And we don't need to go into detail here, but obviously there was a big drop in the quality and just amount of dialogue in the final season, especially not just the last couple seasons. So for me, on one level, I wanted more dialogue and explanation for everybody and everything.
Sure.
Within the context of everybody kind of getting less of that, I think the situation with Dany does work. Now, for me, again, I prefer having more context overall. But in terms of how they were telling the story in the final season, I don't think it's so much as a positive versus it was an essential. Because we were definitely not meant to fully understand, and we were meant to be able to stop empathizing and feeling with Daenerys, and she was supposed to have become this monster at that point, this beautiful monster that our main character Jon Snow was in love with and couldn't admit that he was a monster. And what I love so much about this series, and what's so relevant for our own time, whether we're looking at what's happening right now in Syria or even some of what's happening at home in the US here, is that people get so caught up in their kind of rah-rah faction, I'm with this group, I'm with that group, and they really build individuals up to be these almost, in their minds, they can do no wrong, these perfect people. Even when they're doing things that are clearly wrong, people will get on television and just say, nope, everything's fine, we're all fine. And I kind of I've always loved Grey Worm as a character, and I think, we're not meant to hate him. I think he's one of us. Like, if we were on that side of things, I think we would end up being Grey Worm. Very few of us would be Jon. And in fact, even Jon's own Northmen went with the Grey Worm mentality. Jon had to fight some of his own people to get them to listen. Very few were even willing to be controlled at that point. So I think Dany kind of is a little bit of the monster inside all of us. Like, we could be this beautiful, ambitious person who's been abused and mistreated in our own right, who has to overcome to be where they are. And that doesn't mean that we're going to end up being the good guys. And I think that this show makes us all question, are we still the good guys, instead of just assuming that we are, and to make us ask that, the people around us, the people we choose to follow, the people we project all our hopes and dreams onto. And honestly, I feel like the fans kind of fell, I don't know if it was a deliberate trap, but they kind of did what they were supposed to. They were supposed to, I think they kind of sucked us in, and they were trying, the showrunners, I think, were trying to be like, aha, see, that's what you get for wishing for a dragon queen to liberate everybody.
Very eloquently put, Brian. Finally, we're going to wrap up pretty quick here, but I also liked your section on the choosing of Bran as king, and kind of your comments on how it represented an incremental step forward for Westeros rather than some kind of big, society-changing movement. Where does this fit into your greater theory of history in Game of Thrones?
Well, I'll pick an example that will probably drive a lot of people crazy, but let's go back to the 2016 election. You've
already brought it up way too much, but keep going. This is Wit Club, where we can be a little more free with our dialogue and say some off color. We can even curse a little bit. Not bad though. Okay, so
shit,
go
that's
on.
Great. Okay, so with the 2016 election, you had generally the right and the left, and there's sort of a middle, but most people in the middle break one way or the other most of the time, consistently. So you got your right and your left. And on the left, you had the people who were saying, we need a political revolution. These are the people that were really behind Bernie Sanders. And they were so disappointed in Hillary Clinton winning that they kind of decided to almost either to some degree sabotage on one end or just sit out on the other.
The Bernie Bros. Okay, yeah.
And those people not participating and joining with that left faction in the end was as much a reason as anybody that the Electoral College votes in particular states went a certain way. And, it's about, are you going to be so upset that you don't get the exact specific outcome that you want? Or are you going to look at the bigger picture, realize that there's a whole bunch of other people you have to worry about? Are you going to make some kind of compromise? And Bran was the ultimate compromise because none of those vying houses really got to benefit from it. Even the Starks, like he's not really in it for the Starks, obviously. And I think everyone could tell that.
I mean, yeah, so you say that, but also, I mean, he let the North go 3 seconds in.
True. I think he just didn't care.
Me too.
But true. That's a very fair point. He just did not care, though.
I'd agree, but I liked your points about how it represented, and just the views of Brian Frydenberg do not necessarily represent the views of WIC and its many affiliates, politically speaking. Just a disclaimer.
Of course, yes.
Although they might, you don't know.
Sorry, they might, but we want everybody and anybody of any persuasion to tune in and read.
So yeah, I enjoyed that. Any other thoughts you wanted to share, Brian, about any of your thoughts? Because clearly you put a lot of thought into this, and if you have anything you want to say, let's give you the platform. So far, long as it isn't insane to just voice.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll avoid the insanity. Unlike certain characters we've grown to love and maybe then fall out of love with. But I guess for me, what's so interesting is, and I recognize that there was a unique level of intensity, a unique level of expectation and build up to the final season. But for a show that consistently said, hey, you wanted this, but we're not giving you that, and we're going to turn your expectations on its head, but not just do it for the sake of doing it. Like, this is going to fit in with how this world operates. This is going to fit in with the approaches that these different main characters take, the real life consequences that would often happen from these approaches or would not. And to keep that going, but then in particular seasons, because it was the very, very few characters that were remaining that people had grown with for all that time, when they got the same treatment, somehow that was just so terrible and the world was ending. I mean, because honestly, other than The Last Jedi, I'm 38 years old almost, and I've never seen a fan reaction like this that was so intensely negative. Not everybody, but the portion of people who had a negative reaction and the intensity. And I would push back against all these people, not to say that there are individual situations that are frustrating. And I was frustrated as a fan as well sometimes, but to kind of hate on the show for just doing what it had been doing all throughout, but in a more extreme way for the final season. I'm just sort of flabbergasted at the kind of lack of self-awareness, but in some ways that's a beauty to both the fans and the show, because people got so wrapped up into it that they weren't capable of they were rooting for their character. They had been through all that fighting, and it's just like the people who followed them to the end in the show. So in many ways, we actually got sucked into what I would say is the reality of this fantasy series, and it's a special kind of cultural phenomenon that we won't see again anytime soon, I think. And, to have that kind of reaction and passion, it was just to be a part of it, to have the privilege of writing for you guys and to engage with fans all over the world from this. I mean, it's been a hell of a ride, and would I have done some things differently? Sure. But I hope when people calm down, they'll actually appreciate some of the points I've made, not because I made them, but they'll just step back and be like, you know what, that wasn't, they kind of fucked with us a bit. And that's what we loved about the show from the beginning, except at the end. And maybe we should still appreciate that at the end.
I mean, I think folks were pretty reasonably responded to your article. And I share your hope that once we get some distance from this, I'm actually looking forward to a couple years down the line where there's going to be a bunch of reappraisals of Game of Thrones in 5 years, right? People will look back and write some think pieces about, what did it really mean? Was the ending really that bad? And have some look backs. I'm looking forward to that phase of the discourse. But that'll be then. Before that, I agree with you. We probably won't see anything that kind of captures the collective headspace of a nation for a while, and it was definitely
the world.
thrilled to-
I was in
yeah, the
Jordan
world.
almost the whole time this stuff was going down, especially the 8th season, and almost everybody I knew in Jordan or when I was in Israel, like one thing that unites Israelis and Palestinians is Game of Thrones, apparently. But seriously, like whenever I was traveling, I would just be like at a bar in Tel Aviv or in Amman, and I would just hear people talk. Can you believe Jon Snow did this? Or I'd be hearing Arabic, Wallah, Jon Snow, and I'd just be like, oh my god, like
it is going to be
really
hard
cool.
to find something that can work on that level. Whether you're united in love or rage, it's good to be together. So I'll look at I'm sure we'll both look forward to what does that next, if anything. Brian, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Hope you can come back.
Pleasure, Dan. And I wanted to hear more about your views, but I guess I was the guest. So
Yeah.
or maybe I just talked too much.
They know my views. It's fine. Okay. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll be back next month with another Take the Black Club episode.
Excellent.
Thanks
oh
for-
wait, and let me show off my shirt real quick.
Yes. Go ahead and show off your
Tyrion
shirt.
shirt, just the I drink and I know things shirt.
Classic.
That's what I do. I drink and I know things. I felt like I had to. So
I should have brought some beer onto this thing. Oh, well, next time.
yes, actually we can plan for that.
We can. Thanks for coming on, Brian. Thanks for watching, everybody out there. Have a pleasant afternoon.
You too. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Winter is coming.
Adios.